Right. Thanks, Gwendon. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to this webinar. My name is Sid Gupta, and I'm a Senior Product Manager with AWS Config. I'm joined by Shayan Biswas, who's also a Senior Product Manager with Config, and he'll be our Q&A moderator. Please submit your questions at any time during this webcast, and Shayan will try to address as many of them throughout the presentation. I'll also answer a few in the live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll send you an email with the URL for the recording, as well as a link to the presentation deck. So let's get started. So what can you expect from this session? First, I'll talk about what is governance and compliance, and why you should care. Then I'll explain why it's a good idea to automate them. I'll introduce you to a couple of services in the AWS Management Tools, like CloudTrail and Config, and demonstrate how you can use these services to automate governance and compliance. Finally, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Okay. So what is governance and what is compliance? Governance, in the broad sense, is the oversight role and the process by which companies manage and mitigate risks. In the case of IT, it puts structure around how organizations align IT strategy with business strategy, ensuring that companies stay on track to achieve their goals. Compliance, on the other hand, ensures that an organization has the processes and controls in place to meet the requirements set forth by the governance body. Now let me explain the need for governance and compliance, especially in the context of the cloud. The cloud introduces few fundamental changes to traditional IT. For example, developers can now request IT resources such as virtual machines, databases, routers, firewalls via APIs. They no longer have to wait on servers to be procured, installed, and configured by your IT department or your security team, as they can configure these resources in a self-service manner. Lack of oversight in this case could often result in misconfiguration, leaving your resources exposed to attackers and putting your business at risk. Secondly, in the cloud, you only pay for what you use. So if you have a number of orphan resources in the cloud, for example, EBS volumes that are not attached to an EC2 instance, without proper governance, you end up paying for those unused resources. Thirdly, since cloud is elastic in nature, your resources can scale dynamically to support your application's peak traffic requirements. These resources may be short-lived, as the cloud allows you to instantly grow or shrink capacity. Even if resources are up and running for only a few minutes, it's important to ensure that those resources have the appropriate security baselines so that they don't become the weak link in the chain and allow attackers to enter your infrastructure. In summary, if you don't implement governance in the cloud, you could end up losing the benefits of the cloud. A good governance strategy will get ahead of this trend by leading standards-based, policy-driven cloud services in a cost-effective manner. Good governance also helps in ensuring that you follow the AWS Shared Security model. Under the Shared Responsibility model, AWS manages and controls the components from the host operating system and the virtualization layer down to the physical security of the facilities in which the services operate. And our customers are responsible for building secure applications, securing the guest operating system, network and firewall configurations such as EC2 groups, security groups, and securing their data at rest via various encryption mechanisms. Customers must carefully consider the services they choose because their responsibility varies with the services they choose. So for all these reasons outlined above, you most definitely need a governance strategy when using the cloud for building your applications. Here are some steps to ensure good cloud governance and compliance. First, understand your IT environment. This includes gathering an inventory of your resources running in the cloud and their configuration. Document all compliance requirements. This could be internal policies or external regulatory requirements such as PCI, HIPAA, or SOX compliance. Next, design and implement controls that map to these compliance requirements. Identify and document controls owned by outside parties. This could be AWS, for example, for things related to the physical infrastructure and host operating system. Lastly, verify that all control objectives are met. Approaching governance and compliance in this manner will help customers gain a better understanding of their cloud environment and help clearly define the verification activities that must be performed. Now that we know why cloud governance is necessary, let's talk about why we should automate these policies and controls. Due to the dynamic nature of the cloud, resources may come and go within the same day. It's hard to manually keep track of resources and their current as well as historic configuration. There are also numerous compliance requirements and best practices prescribed by our own InfoSec department as well as the industry, such as CIS benchmarks. Periodic assessments like half-yearly or annual assessments are no longer useful in the cloud, especially since resources could come and go within the same day. Instead, you need the ability to continuously assess the compliance status of resources. And that can only be achieved via automation. Finally, as your business grows, you need the ability to manage governance and compliance at scale. As you hire more people to grow your business, it takes time for one to familiarize with cloud best practices. Misconfigurations could occur, and mistakes could prove costly to the business. As a security administrator, you want to enforce controls, but at the same time, you don't want to hamper developer productivity. By automating the governance policies and compliance verification checks, you can address both needs. Automation would help you get there and relieve the operational burden on your teams. So let's recap what I've gone through so far. I've discussed the need for governance in the cloud and why you would benefit from automating it in the long run. Now let's see how AWS Management Tools can help you in these areas. AWS Management Tools offer a range of capabilities, starting with provisioning services such as AWS CloudFormation and Service Catalog, which help with speed and agility, to services that provide guardrails for better visibility and control, such as AWS CloudTrail, AWS Config, and Amazon CloudWatch. Today we'll focus on two tools, AWS CloudTrail and AWS Config, from a governance and compliance perspective. So what is CloudTrail? AWS CloudTrail is a service that enables governance, compliance, and operational auditing and risk auditing of your AWS account. It records API calls made on your AWS account and delivers logs into your S3 bucket, which can be used for audit or compliance. You can look up the history of AWS API calls for your account, including API calls made through the AWS Management Console or the SDKs or command line tools and other AWS services. You can send CloudTrail events to CloudWatch and create alarms. For example, you can create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm that gets triggered when an Amazon S3 API call is made to put or delete a bucket policy. AWS CloudTrail also supports Amazon S3 data events. We're excited to add this new capability. Data events are object-level API operations that access Amazon S3 buckets, such as get object, delete object, and put object. By default, the trails don't log data events, but you can configure trails to log data events for S3 objects that you specify. You can receive detailed information such as the AWS account of the caller, the IAM user role of the caller, time of the API call, IP address of the API, and other details. Here are some common use cases for CloudTrail. It is used as a compliance aid, as CloudTrail makes it easy to ensure compliance with internal policies and regulatory standards by providing a history of all API calls in your account. You can perform security analysis and detect user behavior patterns by ingesting these CloudTrail API call history into your log management and analytics solution such as CloudWatch Logs, CloudWatch Events, Athena, Elasticsearch, or other third-party solutions. You can detect data exfiltration by collecting activity data on S3 objects through object-level API events recorded in CloudTrail. After the activity data is collected, you can use the other AWS services such as Amazon CloudWatch events and AWS Lambda to trigger response procedures. You can troubleshoot operational issues by leveraging the AWS API call history produced by CloudTrail. For example, you can quickly identify the most recent changes made to your resources in your environment, including creation, modification, and deletion of AWS resources. Now let's take a look at AWS Config. AWS Config is a service that continuously monitors and records your AWS resource configurations and allows you to automate the evaluation of recorded configurations against desired configurations. It sends you a real-time notification whenever the configuration or the compliance status of your key resources has changed. You can get your AWS resource inventory, current as well as historic configuration of resources via APIs. You can also access the history as well as a point-in-time snapshot of the configuration of all resources via your S3 bucket. Besides continuously recording the configuration of your resources, you can get a list of resources in your account, including the resources that were previously deleted. You can view how resources are related to each other. For example, security groups and storage volumes are associated with an EC2 instance. This information helps in understanding your IT environment, which, if you recall, was the first step towards good cloud governance. You can also view changes to software applications and OS patches installed on your EC2 instances via Config's integration with EC2 Systems Manager. So Config is a service that tracks configuration changes to not just various resource types within AWS, but also to various software packages on your EC2 instance. You can check compliance of a resource with desired configuration using config rules. These checks can be configured to run every time a configuration change event occurs or even periodically. You can use one of the 35 pre-built rules called manage rules or develop your own rule using custom rules functionality. AWS Config will notify you via SNS the moment your resource configuration change is recorded or your resource goes out of compliance. We also present these findings on a compliance dashboard. And finally, you can also share and benefit from the rules created by the AWS community through a new repository available on GitHub. Here are some of the common use cases for AWS Config. With AWS Config, you're able to continuously monitor and record configuration changes to your resources. This means that you would get notified via SNS as soon as the configuration change is detected by config, instead of you having to periodically monitor your resources for changes. Next, you can continuously assess the compliance state of your resources with your internal or regulatory policies. This capability ensures that even if resources may be up and running for only a few minutes, we would run compliance checks to ensure that it complies with your policies. For example, is the new EC2 instance tagged with appropriate key value pairs? You can also take advantage of the visual dashboard to check your overall compliance status and quickly spot non-compliant resources. This information helps with audit and compliance. Config also helps you with change management. With AWS Config, you're able to track the relationships amongst resources and review resource dependencies prior to making changes. This information helps you assess how a change to a resource configuration would affect your other resources, which minimizes the impact of change-related incidents. Config can simplify troubleshooting of your operational issues since it maintains a record of all configuration changes to your resource. So hopefully by now, you have a good idea of the capabilities of these services. Well, now comes the exciting part, demos. I will first show you a demo around visibility, audit, and troubleshooting. Let's go to the CloudTrail console first. So I want to look up the API activities for a new developer that I just hired in my team. Let's say she's called Daisy, and I want to see what activities has she been performing on my account. I'm particularly interested in knowing what are some of the security related API actions that she has taken, especially because I want to ensure that I don't put the business at risk due to a misconfiguration in the security group, for example. So we're at the CloudTrail console, and I'm looking up the API activities for Daisy. So it looks like there are a couple of API activities related to security groups. Let's dig in further. So as you can see, CloudTrail gives me all details related to the API call. Things like the source IP address, who initiated the API call, in this case it's Daisy, what was the resource group that was modified, what is the resource ID, in this case it's the security group, and all those details related to the API call. Now let's try to find out what was the actual change made to the security group. So for that purpose, I'll go to the AWS Config console through the config timeline icon available here within CloudTrail. So this icon takes me to the AWS Config console. Now right at the top, we see a timeline of all changes or events that occurred on the security group. For example, I see there are a couple of events that occurred on October 26th. Let me dig into those events. I see here right at the bottom information that has been pulled from CloudTrail, which shows that the security group ingress was modified. Let's try to look at what was the actual change made. So if I click on changes, AWS Config shows me what was the prior value of the change and what is the next value or the new value of the change. So it looks like previously the security group only allowed access to a particular IP address to connect to port 22 or SSH on that EC2 security group. But that was modified to allow any IP address in the internet to connect to the port 22. So that's a big security gap, isn't it? In addition, I can also look at some relationships on the AWS console. So let's go to the relationships tab here. So as you can see, this shows me how the security group is related to other resource types within AWS. For example, this security group is connected to a couple of EC2 instances, EC2 network interfaces, and EC2 VPC. This information is helpful for doing an impact assessment if you're reviewing a change request, for example. So any modification to the security group, I know exactly how that would affect other resources in my account. So let's get back to the presentation. So basically, we looked at how CloudTrail was able to detect API activities for a particular user, and then I was able to view the configuration of that resource via its integration with AWS Config. Now let's see how I can use automation to get to an alarm whenever certain configuration changes occur. So I'll go to the config console and let me create a rule. So basically what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create a rule that would automatically find out all EC2 groups, all EC2 security groups that have allowed access from anywhere to connect on port 22. Previously, I was able to find that out by looking up the user Daisy in the CloudTrail console. But what if I have a number of developers and there may be a lot more security groups with the same configuration or misconfiguration in this case? So in this case, I need an automated way to scan all of my EC2 security groups and then get alerted if there is any security group that is misconfigured. So I'm going to create an AWS config rule. AWS config offers out of the box about 35 managed rules, which helps customers like you to immediately apply those rules to your account. The AWS restricted SSH is one such rule, which automatically identifies those security groups. I can trigger this rule either periodically or on configuration changes. So anytime any change occurs on the EC2 security group, this rule would get automatically triggered. So I'll attach the EC2 security group resource type to this rule, and let me save this rule. So as soon as I save this rule, it automatically scans all of my security groups and looks like it has detected about 8 resources which are non-compliant with this rule. Let's try to find out what are those resources. So what you see here is sort of like a compliance dashboard where you get a list of all security groups that are non-compliant with my rule. So essentially, I've got a bunch of security groups out there that allow anyone access to port 22 or SSH. I can click on any resource identifier out here and see the config timeline for that resource. This brings us to the familiar AWS Config timeline page where you can see all the events, the changes, and the relationships associated with that resource. All right, so we saw how we used AWS Config rules to automatically scan your EC2 security groups, and you get a list of all non-compliant security groups. AWS Config sends you a notification via SNS whenever the compliance status of the resource changes. So in this case, this is how the SNS would look like. It mainly contains the security group, the resource ID in this case, and information about non-compliance. So you'd see the name of the rule. In this case, it was the restricted SSH config rule. It gives you details about when the resource went non-compliant, so that now you can use this information to trigger workflows that could remediate this particular issue. We saw how we can use AWS Config to continuously monitor your EC2 security groups and get alerted if someone opened up a security group to the internet. Now, what if Daisy made some changes to software packages on an EC2 instance? Wouldn't it be nice to know if she installed certain applications that are blacklisted by our InfoSec department? In this demo, I will show you how you can track changes to applications installed on your EC2 using AWS Config. All this is possible via our integration with EC2 Systems Manager, which we announced in the last reInvent. With this integration, you can also track changes to operating system patches, such as Windows patches. So I'll go to the EC2 console, and let's look at the EC2 Systems Manager, which is the managed instances. I've already set up a few EC2 instances using the EC2 Systems Manager. So let's set up an inventory for one of the EC2 instances out here. Okay, I'll select this EC2 instance. I'll schedule it to run every 30 minutes. So basically, EC2 Systems Manager would collect the inventory and ship it over to AWS Config every 30 minutes. I'll also specify what information needs to be collected in the inventory. So in this case, information about applications, AWS components on that instance, such as AWS CLI, network config, Windows updates, and custom inventory. I'll set up inventory. Let's look at the status of that inventory. Looks like it was successfully created. Using EC2 Systems Manager console, I can search for any particular application on my EC2 instance. For example, let me search for Mozilla on if any of my instances have Mozilla installed on them. So it looks like it detected one EC2 instance. So let me go to the inventory tab and look at the list of all applications loaded on that EC2 instance. You can see there are a couple of software packages, Mozilla Firefox installed out there. Now let's look at the change history for those software packages. So for things related to change, you would use AWS Config. So for example here, with our integration with EC2 Systems Manager, you can just go to the AWS Config timeline icon here on the right side, which takes you to the AWS Config console. Again, this is the familiar AWS Config timeline view, where you see all changes that occurred to software packages installed on your managed inventory. You can see that we're getting information from EC2 Systems Manager regarding Windows updates, application, network configuration, and custom inventory. I can also see the relationships of that EC2 instance, the managed inventory in this case being related to the EC2 instance. I can get more details about what software packages and applications are installed. If I click on this link here, it gives me this list of all applications here installed on this instance. Now, using AWS config rules, I can also find out if there are any applications that must be installed on all EC2 instances. So for example, I want to make sure that AWS CLI is installed on all EC2 instances. For that purpose, I could use a managed rule called EC2 Managed Instance Applications, and then set up AWS CLI as the software package that should be present on all managed instances. So let's go here and set that up. I will basically enter the application name that must be verified on all instances. In this case, let me type in command line interface and save it. As soon as I save it, AWS Config will start evaluating all EC2 managed instances and look for the AWS CLI package. So it looks like it identified that one resource is non-compliant with that policy and one resource is compliant with it. I can drill down to see more details about which application was being checked by this rule. So in this case, it's the AWS command line interface. Similar to the rule that I just demoed, you could also have a rule where you could list all the applications that should not be present on your and that's possible through the EC2 managed instance applications blacklisted config rule. I encourage you to try that out when you get a chance. So far I've shown you how to track changes to AWS resources such as EC2 security groups, as well as on-instance resource inventory such as software packages and Windows patches using AWS Config. I've shown you how you can use config rules to verify compliance and alert you via SNS notifications. Now let's see how we can configure a workflow to only trigger an action that brings your resource back into compliance. Let's stick to the example that I had before, where Daisy, our application developer, opened up an EC2 security group to the internet to temporarily gain access to the EC2 instance from her home. Config would change and send an SNS notification, which in turn would trigger a Lambda function that revokes the EC2 ingress rule that Daisy created. Okay. So I'll go to the config console, and let's look at the settings, because I want to find out what is my SNS topic that I need to configure. So it looks like I have a SNS topic called config topic. This is where I stream all changes, all configuration changes, as well as compliance notifications. So anytime your resource gets modified or your resource goes out of compliance, we will stream that event via SNS to this particular topic. Now that I know the name of the topic, let me go to the SNS console and view this topic. Okay, there it is, config topic. So I'll mainly go ahead and create a subscription A subscription is something that would subscribe to this topic. So it will look for the content of the topic and then take appropriate action. I could create a subscription using an email as a protocol, but in this case, I'll use Lambda as a protocol. So let me go ahead and create a subscription. Choose Lambda as a protocol. I've got a Lambda function that I had pre-created before this demo. So let me use that. I'll create the subscription. Now my subscription got created. So the Lambda function that I created essentially looks for the SNS notification, and it will look for the config rule name called restricted SSH and see if it has a message called non-compliant. As soon as it detects that message, it will then invoke a function called the revoke security group ingress function. Now, this is what that function looks like. Essentially, it's something that just looks at the incoming data and then revokes that security group, basically removing the group that allowed access to anyone from the internet to connect on port 22. So basically what I showed you here was a mechanism by which as soon as a non-compliant event happens, you can trigger a Lambda function to call the appropriate APIs to revert back to the original settings. In this case, it removed the security group that allowed anyone access to your port 20. All right, so we've talked about how you can use CloudTrail config to implement cloud governance. But what if someone disabled one of these services, let's say CloudTrail? Would that break all the automation that you've built around it? The good news is that you can use CloudWatch to trigger Lambda functions that basically turn on CloudTrail. So let me go ahead and show you how you can do that. So I'll go to the CloudWatch console this time, and I'll create a CloudWatch event rule. I'll select the event source. In this case, it's an AWS API call from CloudTrail, and I'll specify which API actions that I need to monitor. In this case, since I will be looking for something like stop logging or delete trail, I want to configure that in this rule. So let's select that. Select delete trail, stop logging, and update trail. I'll also add a target. This is the target that would receive the event that matches the rule that you defined. In this case, my target would be a Lambda function that I have pre-created. So this is what the Lambda function looks like. Essentially, it's going to look for events around CloudTrail for the stop logging function. And as soon as it detects that event, it would then fire an API call to start logging. So now that the rule is created, let's walk over to the CloudTrail console. And let's try to stop logging for one of the trails. I'll select this trail. As you can see, the logging is currently turned on. Now I will turn it off. As soon as it's turned off, if you refresh your screen, my screen in this case, I'll notice that the logging turned on again. Now behind the scenes, I ended up using that CloudWatch event rule which fired a Lambda function, which essentially started the logging again. Here is the code snippet that I used, and I can share this information at the end of the presentation as well. So here are some customers who are using CloudTrail and Config. Just like them, we encourage you to use CloudTrail and Config and establish good cloud in your organization. Let me wrap up this presentation by summarizing what I've presented. CloudTrail and Config provide broad and deep visibility for security and compliance. They enable you to establish good governance policies and verify compliance. They allow you to standardize your processes and automate your governance and compliance without compromising on self-service or impacting developer productivity. For more details, please visit our websites and review documentation. I'd encourage you to go ahead and turn on these services and play around with it. You can use the code snippets that I've provided in this presentation as a guidance and let us know what you think. That brings us to the end of the presentation. We can now open up for Q&A. Thank you.